It's time for Uncle Hank. Question everything with M. Kalani Souza and Uncle Hank Bergerstrom.
Okay, gang, welcome back to another episode of Uncle Hank, where we question everything. Good to see you again, Uncle Hank.
Hey, thank you very
Hey,
much.
so what's the big question this week?
Okay, so I think the subject that we really need to cover is the State Historic Preservation Act.
SHPE, you mean?
SHPE, yes.
Yeah, state
And the reason
historic.
for that is that the more we investigate into this, the more we find out they're not protecting anything to do with Hawaiian. They're actually protecting their own history, like aviation relics, artifacts are the top of the line.
Wait, slow it down. Okay, the State Historic Preservation Act,
Yes.
the state of Hawaii, that
Yes.
is not in fact protecting Hawaiian history.
Well, okay, so State Historic Preservation Act comes from the National Historic Preservation Act. And the state has been given the authority to oversee how it's regulated in Hawaii. So we have the State Historic Preservation Act, or SHPE. Now, it is of course designed to take into focus things like the Native American Greys Repatriation Act, NAGPRA. Okay, it has to do with burials.
Right.
Okay, so this all falls into that National Historic Preservation Act. The problem that we're having here is that the State Historic Preservation Act does not function in any kind of logical way to actually preserve Hawaiian remains. Okay, and the reason I say that is you can go to their offices and find thousands of Hawaiian bones in boxes. You can go down to Kauai Hau Church, go into their basement, hundreds of ewi stacked up.
Okay, so wait a minute. Bones in boxes, both at the State Historic Preservation Office and down at Kauai Hau Church. How's Kauai Hau Church all tied up with bones in boxes?
Because they're Hawaiian Greys, and this is something very important to understand. The reason why they put Hawaiians in boxes for the longest time is because they say they're coming from non-identifiable graves. In other words, they're not marked with grave markers. Okay, and that's pretty much how they determine. And they can prove that they're over 50 years old. But what's interesting, this has always been confined to the Hawaiian remains that were unmarked graves. Now we're finding that it also seems to apply to graves that were marked if they're Hawaiian graves, which is what Kauai Hau is, right? It's all marked graves. Now, I don't know what the big deal was down there at first. It varies in whose history you're listening to, why they had to do it in the first place. They're going to build up their area to make a bigger church or some kind of more of a community setting.
So they removed graves from the gravesite.
So they took the graves out.
So what, all the graves, Haole graves, Chinese graves,
Yes.
Filipino graves, and Hawaiian graves?
Yes. But, it brings the question, aren't graveyards sacred? All graveyards are sacred?
Wow. You mean it's looking more like sacred is as sacred does?
Yeah, just like stupid as a stupid does.
I got you. But I mean, if we're asking the right questions, it's got to be, are sacred and sacrosanct contracts entered into with people who have their last wishes carried out and are buried in proper ways? Is it to be determined that for commerce or for business that they are later retracted and those agreements are null and void because of commerce?
That is apparently what's happening. When we look at the State Historic Preservation Act, we got to first note that it is part of the National Historic Preservation Act, which is also tied into the EPA.
And by national, you mean the United States of America national?
Yes, yes, and that also ties into the Environmental Preservation Act because
EPA.
The EPA, right? And as you know, they're all under question right now under Trump. He's trying to get rid of all these things.
Wow, he's getting rid of the Environmental Protection Agency. He gets rid of a lot of the natural resource management, a lot of human social services evaporating.
That's what's happening in front of us, and it's like the question you have to ask yourself: why did we set this up to protect in the first place if we're not going to afford the protection? Right?
Wow.
I mean, we spent a lot of money setting these offices up. They're set up to go good at first, and then they're left to die on the tree. So, kind of like the State Historic Preservation
the
Act.
Environmental Protection Agency, that was set up during the 70s, correct?
Yes.
So these laws of the 70s and 80s and possibly 90s are being outdone and done away with here in the late 20s.
Yeah. It's when I say done away with, I'm really trying to say that it's become non-functional. Okay, like it's not even there. Like a very good, for instance, and this just recently happened on Maui, having to do with the EVs that they're digging up on Maui. And the Maui.
Yeah, I heard something about that. A couple of staunch community advocates made a stand, I understand, in a construction site.
Right. And so because there's Hawaiian burials there are a lot of Hawaiians out there protesting, trying to protect their burials.
Ew.
But they approached the State Historic Preservation people, and the State Historic Preservation Officer, Hinano Rodriguez.
What do you have to say?
He actually came out. He did the same thing that Pu'aiu did 12 years ago at Naui, where he came out and says, we want to thank the Maui Lani Burial Council for all their efforts.
They're grateful, at least.
They're grateful. However, they're only in an advisory capacity. This is so very important to understand because you need to question this. How is it that we spend all this money?
Wait, you mean as an advisory capacity? What does that mean?
That means that you can give them advice, but they don't have to take your advice.
So it's not regulatory or binding in any way.
In any shape or form.
So the public's advice and contribution and the respected elder contribution to the conversation is one that has no weight or no bearing and has no regulatory status, so they don't really have to listen to the community, do they?
No, and this is the problem, because the amount of effort is to find the lineal descendants of these graves and to talk to the Kupuna Council, which are the elders, of course. This takes a long time. You're talking about bringing out information that is forbidden within our culture. We don't talk about graves. We don't talk about where we put them. They were very sacred to Hawaiian. Okay, so, but the only way to protect them under this system right now is that you have to go through this historic preserve, register these bodies, these bones, or these sites. But unless you can actually identify that this exact spot that I'm pointing at is where Grandpa so-and-so is laying. And if they don't find one there, you're lying. And it's like, we just told you this whole area is a known burial area. That's not good enough for them. Even if it was good enough for them, and I'm going to switch quickly to Naui because there was a question there. They had ground penetrating radar. They went and proved that yes, they have the graves there. They're in the sitting position. After all that was done, that took 2.5 years to do. After all that was done, and we're only talking about a size of a lot that's one lot. Not even a full lot, actually. And you got 38 Hawaiian Greys there in the sitting position. Well-known, documented to be there. So it's not like it's not an unknown gravesite. This is an unknown gravesite. And so after 2.5 years, finally when the Burial Council of Kauai finally gets it together and decides, yes, we're not going to build there, leaves a EV in place, make sure it's marked and everything. And the Burial Council, who was under the direction of Pu'aiu at the time, did the same thing. That, in fact, Hinano Rodriguez quoted the exact same line. Thank you very much in your capacity as the Burial Council of that time Hawaii, and now it's Maui. Thank you very much for your diligent work in finding out who these EV belong to and how it's going to be protected. But you're only in an advisory capacity, and as such, you don't have the weight to command anything. So we can't command protection or anything else. It's up to them. And the problem we have is we have one or two archaeologists doing this entire state, okay, somehow or another, and they are being called every day to go all over the place, okay, and most of the time you hear that there's no significant findings. There's no significant findings because you don't go out and look. And because it is so well known that Hawaiian EV can cause you a delay in your construction problem, what happens when they start laying it out? They go out there and bulldoze the things down in the first place before you have a site survey.
And sounding like they don't report things on time. It's not in their best interest.
It's not in their best interest.
It's really hard to get human beings to operate any other capacity than their best interest. So, although we have to trust in the state to take care of us, you can see there's a lot of questions to be had about the burial council.
And the biggest question is, are we going to allow them to have the say on our EV? That's the question that should be asked, because nothing that they have in place that is supposed to protect us has actually protected us.
Wow. A lot more questions to be asked, Gangi. We'll see you the next time on Uncle Hank. Question everything.
Question everything, brah. Everything. Aloha mai.
Come be a part of a minority view.
Ao he pau ike, I ka halau ho o kahi.